Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. It's been a pleasure to look into the book Elizabeth and Margaret. I wondered how the relationship was between the two sisters, and it's been much closer than I thought it would be. I have a twin sister, and we have always been close, and I'm glad Queen Elizabeth and her sister had that bond too. So let us continue on our journey and see what happens with the sisters today. A friend of Margaret's didn't think that she was envious of Princess Elizabeth, but she did look for a purpose in life. Marriage and children did appeal to her, but she wanted more. But what that might be, she didn't know. Princess Margaret did have religious faith. She had a white leather Bible, and it was her guide and consolation. People started to notice the chemistry between Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend. A young socialite named Jane Van Tempest Stewart returned after visiting Balmoral in 1950, and she told her mother that she thought Margaret and Peter were in love. Her mother said, "Don't be so romantic and ridiculous. He's the king's servant. She can't be in love with the king's servant. That would be utterly wrong." And Margaret's friend, Colin Tennant, said years later, if the king had lived, he would have made Princess Margaret marry Johnny Dalkeith. He later became a respected member of Parliament, but he didn't want to enter into the royal family, though. In January 1951, Margaret went to spend a week in Malta with her sister. She said, "I fully expect to see the sun." Prince Philip, when not in the Magpie, was racing his yacht, or he's practicing his polo skills on a wooden practice horse. He would walk the cobbled streets to take a swim in the sea, and he had a butler there to carry his clothes and towel. Elizabeth loved her independence and drove a car, and she would ride, and she would visit the wives of other naval officers or go shopping to get presents to take home. Things got more exciting when Princess Margaret came to town. She found the downstairs dance floor at the Phoenicia Hotel, and they danced the samba and the rumba, and there were a few days of parties, late nights, and long dinners. Margaret's friend Charmin had become a showbiz press agent, and she said Princess Margaret was eager to go out west. Princess Margaret liked to hear the gossip about Hollywood stars, and she felt that Elizabeth Taylor wore too much eyeliner. Princess Margaret liked to watch musicals like Pal Joey and American comedians like Bob Hope, Abbott and Costello, and Danny Kaye. All this helped her to take her mind off her father's bad health. The king had to have a lung operation. Princess Elizabeth and Philip delayed a 5-week tour of North America so they could be in London for the king's operation. The operation was to take place September 23rd in the Buell Room at room 23 of Buckingham Palace. It was converted into an operating room. The doctors told the royal family they found cancer in the lung they removed. They didn't tell the king. His recovery was slow, and he told Princess Elizabeth and Philip to go ahead to Canada and the United States. And 15,000 people showed up in Montreal. Crawfey's book and being in the Ladies' Home Journal had everybody wanting to see the princess. Some said that she didn't smile a lot, and she didn't understand that because she said her jaw was aching from smiling all the time. Her demeanor was impassive, and that made people think she was unfeeling or aloof, but she was really trying to hide her emotions. When they got back home, her father had gained weight and was talking about shooting and using a light gun. The king was frail, but he insisted Princess Elizabeth and her husband go to Australia and New Zealand in his place. The king went to Sandringham to see his daughter and son-in-law off. Their last evening together was at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, and they watched a performance of South Pacific. Lilibet knew all the lyrics by heart. January 31st, the king was standing for a half-hour hatless on the tarmac at the London airport to say goodbye to his beloved daughter. Princess Elizabeth said, "He's like that. He never thinks of himself." Princess Margaret was there, and she waved at them, but she couldn't raise much of a smile. She was supposed to be going there with her parents, and she would have been having the adventure with Peter if they had gone. And she went back to Sandringham, and she listened to her gramophone records sent to her by her friend Sass to keep her occupied. So Prince Charles and Princess Anne were a distraction for the grandparents and the aunt. Annie, Margaret, and her mother took them to Brancaster Beach on February the 5th, and Charles was paddling in the North Sea, and the king was out shooting hares and rabbits on the 20,000-acre estate. The queen and her daughter went to a nearby village of Leadenham to see the offerings of one of her favorite artists, the Norfolk-based painter Edward Seago. He did landscapes and seascapes. And they went on a cruise in his boat, and then they went back to Sandringham. Before dinner, Margaret played the piano for her father, and he did a crossword puzzle. When they had dinner, the king was in good spirits. They were listening to his racing manager, Charles Moore, describe his adventures in Kenya. The king went to bed at 10:30, and the next morning, February the 6th, at 7:30 a.m., his under-valet, James MacDonald, took the king his tea, but he couldn't wake him up. And when he pulled back the curtain, he realized the king was dead. He had suffered a coronary thrombosis, which was a blood clot that went to his heart. When they told the queen, she raced to his room. She said she thought he was in a deep sleep. She wrote to Queen Mary, "He looked so peaceful then, I realized what had happened." And before she went to tell Princess Margaret, she stood there a moment by his bedside and gently kissed him on the forehead. Princess Margaret was stunned. She said he had died just as he was getting better. She was so upset, and she wanted Princess Elizabeth home as soon as possible. The news was relayed to them when Prince Philip was told. He then took Elizabeth for a walk in the garden and then she found out she was now a queen. When Princess Elizabeth returned to her lodge, her cousin and lady-in-waiting, Paula Mountbatten, gave her a hug and asked, "What can one say?" And Princess Elizabeth shrugged and said blankly, "It's one of those things." Princess Elizabeth kept her feelings hidden by using her years of royal training. It just kicked into gear. Edward Winley, the provincial commissioner, said she was very pale. She was like ice, just like ice. When asked how she took the news, he said she took it like a queen. On the plane ride back, Princess Elizabeth asked her private secretary what was going to happen when they got home. Waiting for the future queen were the senior politicians and the Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He had sobbed when he heard the news of the king's death. As they drove back through the streets of London, people were dressed in black suits and black dresses. There was no hiding their feelings. They were in deep sorrow, and many were in tears. Elizabeth knew she needed to keep her emotions in check while everybody was crying around her. Queen Mary had been an inspiration to show how it was done. She lived through 3 reigns and had lost another son, and went from Marlborough House to Clarence House, where Queen Elizabeth was waiting for her. Queen Mary took her hand and kissed it lightly, and said, "God save the Queen." Then she added, "Lilibet, your skirts are much too short for mourning." Queen Elizabeth went to Sandringham to say goodbye to her father and console her mother and sister. She went to her father's ground-floor bedroom, and his body lay in a coffin. The coffin was made from a single oak which was cut down a month before. She silently promised to follow in his footsteps and make him proud. Even though she was trained for her royal role from a young age, she felt unprepared. She remembered Queen Elizabeth I was 25 when she took the throne, and she didn't have a father to guide and care for her. Her reign was the most notable in British history. Queen Elizabeth II knew she had to be strong for her family and her country. After the funeral was over, Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother couldn't believe the king was gone. When her father was ill, Princess Margaret lightened his mood by singing or playing the piano. She said he was a truly wonderful person, the very heart and center of the family, and no one could have had a more loving and thoughtful father. She was inconsolable. She could barely eat or sleep, and she was given sedatives to ease her grief. She had been given bromides for 4 days in a row to calm her nerves. She started to become reclusive and withdrawn. She felt like she was in a black hole and didn't notice things. Princess Margaret turned to religion for solace and support. She had been a committed Christian from an early age, and she was inspired by her mother, who read to her and Elizabeth in the morning when they ate breakfast. Now Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother had to curtsy to Queen Elizabeth. Princess Margaret had an easier time than the Queen Mother did about being second place. She had found it hard to cope with. Margaret was to go to Clarence House, where Elizabeth and Philip had lived. The new queen and her family moved into Buckingham Palace. The Queen Mother was emotional with all the changes and burst into tears when the topic was raised. She wrote her daughter a letter in March 1952, apologizing for her behavior. She said, "I've been feeling very unhappy all day, and I suppose talking about leaving Buckingham Palace just finished me off." Prince Philip felt the loss too. In weeks he had lost his name, his career, and his home. He had wanted to stay at Clarence House because It was the first house he designed and decorated himself. He said that Buckingham Palace could be used as an office. Churchill and Lascelles told the prince that the Queen's standard flew above Buckingham Palace, and that was where she had to live. The prince was upset that he was the only man in the kingdom not allowed to give his surname to his children. Winston Churchill didn't want Prince Philip, to be like Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. He ended up having a lot of influence over the day-to-day matters, both royal and political. Churchill didn't have ill will toward Philip. He just didn't like or trust him and hoped Philip would not do harm to the country. Churchill made him feel like an outsider. Prince Philip never cared about being king, but he didn't expect to be brutally and cruelly sidelined. He said at one time, "I'm nothing but a bloody amoeba." Then he got jaundice and had to stare at the walls of his new place for 3 weeks. So I'm going to end the video here. Princess Elizabeth had some free and easy times in the early part of her marriage, but the death of her father turned her and Prince Philip's world upside down. Queen Elizabeth had to step into a role she had been groomed for most of her life. Prince Philip had a bad awakening, and his whole world changed forever now, too. Princess Margaret and Queen Mother also found things so different, and Princess Margaret had her faith to turn to, and it did help her get through the darkest hours without the father who meant so much to her. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I also hope everyone has been having a good day. And tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.